Hello. Welcome to my channel, Mission 919, devoted to information and narratives of African achievement, well-being, and prosperity. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the CFA franc. The CFA franc is a currency that is used in 14 African states. It's actually divided into two parts. There's a West African version and a Central African version. I'm basically going to focus on the West African version, which includes countries like Senegal, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, Ivory Coast, Benin, etc., etc. There are 8 of those countries. The CFA franc basically is controlled to a significant extent by the French central bank, and it was originally I guess invented or adopted in 1945 and continued in existence after the independence of the countries of the former French colonial empire. Now, now there's a lot of talk about getting rid of it and exchanging it for the ECO, which will be the currency of the Economic Community of West African States, which will include countries like Ghana and Nigeria, etc. Now, a lot of people, rail against the CFA franc as a form of colonialism and so forth and so on, which is quite understandable. But I think it's important to look at the history and look at the context, to maybe get a little bit of a more nuanced view. Now, essentially, the way I perceive it, the CFA franc was kind of a bargain between France and the African peoples of their empire. France fought a brutal colonial war in Algeria, which they lost between 1954 and 1962, and they also fought a war in Vietnam, which they also lost. So de Gaulle, wanted to not repeat the mistake of entering into these endless colonial wars that France was likely to lose, and also the peoples of West Africa also wanted to avoid the bloodshed and the trauma and the destruction and the upheaval of fighting a war of independence from France. So in a sense, France avoided fighting colonial wars in Africa, in West Africa, and the peoples of West Africa, of the newly independent states, avoided fighting wars of independence in exchange for their for their nominal independence. So the bargain was basically these countries, Senegal, Niger, Chad, would become independent, but their independence would be curtailed. Now, another reason why this might have made sense, or at least from a devil advocate's point of view, you can argue that it made some sense, was that these countries were particularly underdeveloped. They were small in population and they were underdeveloped. In 1960, Africa was still recovering, maybe at the beginning, in the middle of its recovery. It's hard, you can make that case, but it was still very much in recovering from its centuries-long depopulation due to the slave trades, the Atlantic slave trade, the Arab slave trade, and then also the colonial period, which also introduced lots of widespread death due to disease and famine and so forth. So the population of the continent was low, much lower than it would have been otherwise. And if you look at the populations of these countries, many of them were around 5 million or less, about 1/10 the size of the French population at the time. The French population in 1960 was 45 million. Many of these countries, as I said, had populations of 5 million or less. Okay, their economies were very underdeveloped. They were weak. Very little industrialization, low levels of education, infrastructure, hardly existent. The technical expertise, the bureaucratic skills, and so forth to run a modern nation state, also not not in ready supply. Okay, so also there was no Organization of African Union, let alone the subsequent organization of the African Union. So these countries would be economically weak and be left to sink or swim on their own, and probably sink. So it made sense to adopt the CFA from this point of view to maintain monetary stability, keep inflation low, and so forth and so on. But 60 years later, we have very different conditions. First of all, the populations of these countries has, in many cases, grown 400%, whereas the population of France has only grown 40% over the last 60 years, nearly 60 years. And so the relationship, just in population, between France and the so-called France-Afrique has totally changed, and now the population of these countries, of its former colonial empire, is nearing 3 times the size of France. Also, the size of their economies has grown quite a bit too in relationship to France. And the other thing, this is probably the most important thing, is that the rise of Ghana and, of course, Nigeria above all, means that the economic dynamics are completely different. These countries need to orient their economies toward Nigeria, which has a population of over 200 million now, and will reach 300 million before, if you take a nap and you wake up, the population of Nigeria will be 300 million. I mean, it's just an overwhelming gravitational pull in the West African and even Central African regions. The growing size and variety and importance of the Nigerian economy, and so it just makes sense that these countries are going to integrate their trade flows and investment flows with Nigeria, and to a certain extent Ghana as well. And so the CFA becomes a relic, becomes a psychological burden. It's humiliating at this point. It's outlived its usefulness, and so whether or not it's removed definitively next year or not, we'll see. There may be some pullback, there may be some cold feet, there may be some bribery by France, or intimidation. Who knows? But I think all of that, in the long run, is speed bumps, and that the CFA is on its way out, and that's all to the good. It's a necessary change and transition for these countries to become more and more independent, become fully independent, sovereign states, and to start building their economies on a more long-term, rational, and more long-term, rational basis. So, in the name of the ancestors, in the name of the unborn, who are the same, Ashe, 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 and we'll see you soon.